Hello students, so today we are going to talk about the living world. Before beginning this topic, let me ask you a simple question. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when I ask you the difference between a tree in the park and the bench beside it? Yes, so you must be thinking that the tree is a living being, whereas the bench is a non-living thing, and that's the basic difference between these two. Now, if I ask you that on what characteristics did you decide that this tree is a living being, whereas the bench beside it is a non-living thing? Alright, so I'm sure that there are going to be many characteristics of living beings that would be coming into your mind, such as growth, reproduction, development, ability to respond, etc. But here the question arises that is a living being defined or characterized by only these few characteristics? Confused? Alright, so in this module we will be discussing the detailed characteristics that define a living organism. So let us begin with the very first characteristic of living organisms, which is metabolism. We all are aware that there are many chemical reactions taking place inside a living system. Now the sum total of all these chemical reactions is known as metabolism. So we can define metabolism as a term that is used to describe all the chemical reactions which are involved in maintaining the living state of the cells and the organism on the whole. And this chemical reaction, it can be as simple as your body converting whatever you eat or drink into energy. Let's take some more examples. For example, the plants, they carry out the process of photosynthesis to make their food. Similarly, many chemical reactions, in fact biochemical reactions, they take place in the human body also, so that the human body can function properly. So all the activities of a living organism, be it the growth and development, the movements, the responsiveness, the reproduction, etc., they are due to metabolism. Now, just for an extra piece of information, the metabolic reactions can be carried out outside the body of an organism in test tubes in laboratories for the purpose of studying the mechanism behind them. Such reactions are neither living nor non-living, but they are called biological reactions as they involve biochemicals. So students, this characteristic of metabolism is not observant in non-living things at all. And therefore we can conclude that metabolism is a defining property of living organisms. Now if we talk about the next characteristic, then we have growth. So all the organisms, they show growth irrespective of whether they are living or non-living. Living organisms ranging from the simplest unicellular organisms like the mycoplasma to the multicellular complex organisms like the human beings. They show growth by increasing in mass or by increasing in number. Now in some of the organisms like plants, growth continues throughout their life, whereas in others like animals and human beings, it occurs only up to a certain age, after which the cells divide only to replace the worn out and lost cells. Now students, do you know that even the unicellular organisms, they also grow by cell division? Alright, and students, you will be surprised to know that even non-living things are capable of showing growth, such as the mountains, the sand dunes, the boulders, etc. While their growth is external in the form of mass by deposition of the material on the surfaces, like in the case of sand dunes, solidified lava, ice sheets, etc. On the other hand, the living organisms, they show internal growth due to addition of muscular mass, fat, and formation of cells inside the body. For example, the increase in the height of an individual is due to the increase in the number of muscles and cells, and of course the elongation of the bones inside the body. Now, as we saw and understood that growth is shown by both living as well as non-living things, therefore it is considered as a characteristic of living organisms, but not an all-inclusive defining property for them. So clear about the concept of growth? Moving on to the next property or characteristic, we have reproduction. You all are already aware of the term reproduction, right? So let us quickly recall this term. So the formation of new individuals of similar kind, where the progeny possesses features more or less similar to those of the parents, this is known as reproduction. This process is known as reproduction. Now, living organisms have different modes for reproduction based on their needs and the complexity of their body organization. Multicellular or higher level organisms, like the human beings, do you know how they perform reproduction? Yes, so they perform reproduction. They perform sexual reproduction as they possess specialized parts for the process of reproduction. Whereas the lower organisms, they carry out asexual reproduction through specialized or unspecialized parts of a single parent without the formation and fusion of gametes. Alright, let us discuss some more examples of asexual reproduction. So it can occur by the formation of spores, such as in the case of fungi, by binary fission, as in the case of amoeba, by fragmentation, as in the case of Spirogyra, and by regeneration, as in the case of Planaria, and so on. Now students, let me share something very interesting here. Though no non-living being has the power to reproduce or replicate, reproduction is still not considered as an all-inclusive characteristic of living organisms. And can you think why? Yes, that's because many living organisms, they do not reproduce at all. For example, mules, sterile worker bees, and infertile human couples, they do not reproduce at all. And so reproduction is not an all-inclusive characteristic of living organisms. Now, after reproduction, let us talk about the next characteristic, which is cellular organization. So all living organisms possess cellular organization of multiple levels. Now, you know why this organization is required? So this organization is required for an individual so that the subcomponents can work together for the well-being of the organism. Now, each level of organization has its own properties, which may not be found in its constituents. For example, a living cell has its own characteristics, which may not be found in its constituent organelles. The tracheids and vessels, which together combined to form the xylem in plants, cannot perform the function of water transport alone, as then when they form a tissue together. Alright students, so now let's talk about consciousness. You might have had experiences with the leaves of a touch-me-not plant. Now what happens with these leaves? So the leaves of this plant fold when you touch them. Let us take another example. So your pupils, they constrict when your eyes are exposed to bright light, isn't it? So students, can you relate these experiences to a characteristic of a living organism? Yes, you're right. So here we are referring to consciousness. So how do we define consciousness? So consciousness is the awareness of one's surroundings and the response to the external stimuli. Now these external stimuli, they can be physical, chemical or biological. In higher organisms, the stimulus is perceived by what? Right, it is perceived by sense organs such as the eyes, the nose, the ears, etc. Now though plants do not possess sense organs, but they do respond to external factors like light, water, temperature, pollution, etc. All the organisms from primitive prokaryotes to the most advanced and complex eukaryotes, They're able to sense and respond to the environmental factors and conditions. Hence, we can say that consciousness is said to be the defining property of living organisms. Alright students, now you might have heard this term adaptation, right? So what does this term adaptation actually mean? Yes, living organisms are capable of making variations or changes in their form, function, and behavior, which helps them to adjust to their environment. And this property is known as adaptation. For example, hibernation process, which is adapted by most of the amphibians and reptiles when the weather conditions are extremely cold, is an example of short-term adaptation by these species. Now also, the claws of different birds are well adapted to suit their perching habits, and so this is an example of adaptation. So now that we have studied a number of characteristics of living organisms, can you try to define living organisms? Right, so we can define living organisms as self-replicating, evolving, and self-regulating interactive systems which are capable of responding to external stimuli. So students, in this module we have discussed about the various characteristics of living organisms, and then we also defined a living organism. In our next module, we will continue with the details of our beautiful living world. Since we are well equipped with the Hello students, since we are well equipped with the concepts of binomial nomenclature, classification and systematics of living organisms, let us now dive into this topic of taxonomic categories. So what are taxonomic categories? Yes, so taxonomic categories can simply be defined as the system of classifying an individual into specific categories. But here the question arises that why is there a need for classification of organisms? And the answer to this is very simple. So our earth is home to millions of plants, animals, microorganisms, and various living organisms. Now studying each and every one of them is nearly impossible. And that's because it is a very time-consuming and a complex process. Therefore, a mechanism has been devised to classify them in various groups and categories. So scientists can now study few organisms belonging to a category and list out the characteristics of all the organisms belonging to that particular category. Also, this classification helps in discovering the relationships between different organisms. So if we talk about plants, then kingdom, division, class, order, family, genus, and species collectively form the taxonomic hierarchy. Whereas in animals, we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, which are the different taxa. Now the word taxa here symbolizes the different categories of the biological classification. So let's discuss each of them one by one, and let's start with species first. Now species is the smallest taxonomic group in the whole taxonomic hierarchy. Organisms having fundamental similarities share the same species. You can easily distinguish one species from another by noticing the difference in their morphology or physical appearance. Let's take the example of Magnifera indica, which is nothing but the scientific name for mango. And then let's also take Solanum tuberosum, which is potato, and Panthera leo, which is lion. So can you tell me, which species do they all belong to? Right, so here indica, tuberosum, and leo are the species to which these organisms respectively belong to. Now you can easily differentiate between a mango, a lion, and a potato based on their morphology. And thus you know that these belong to different species. So we have 3 different species here. Now according to the biological concept of species given by Ernst Mayr, members of a species can interbreed naturally and produce a fertile offspring. For example, all members of species Leo can interbreed naturally and produce a fertile offspring. Now, do you know what name has been given to the offspring produced by the interbreeding of a lion and a tiger? So the offspring is known as liger. And students, liger is not fertile and therefore is not a part of any species. Now here is another question for you. Can you identify the species to which we human beings belong? So the scientific name of human beings is Homo sapiens, and thus the species we all belong to is sapiens. Now the next taxonomical group is that of genus. So students, can you quickly recall the scientific names of lion, tiger and leopard? Right, so they are Panthera leo for lion, Panthera tigris for tiger, and Panthera pardus for leopard. Now here you can see that the first parts of their names are all the same, while the second part of their names, they are different. Now here the first part of their names, it signifies their genus. So you can see that these three animals, they belong to different species, but they belong to the same genus. And here the genus is Panthera. Alright, let's take another example. So Solanum melangina, which is brinjal, and Solanum tuberosum, which is potato. Now can you quickly identify the genus here? Yes, that's right. So here again the first name, Solanum, it signifies their common genus. So here we can notice that genus Solanum, it differs from the genus Panthera in many ways. And so we know that organisms sharing a genus have less number of similarities among them as compared to the organisms which share the same species. Let's talk about family now. So a family has a group of related genera with an even fewer number of similarities as compared to genus and species. Now a family takes into account both vegetative and reproductive features of plant species. Let's take an example. For example, family Solanaceae comprises of three different genera, which are Solanum, Petunia, and Datura. Now when it comes to animals, then genus Panthera, as we just saw, it had which all animals? Right, so it had lions, tigers and leopards. Now on the other hand, genus Felis has cats in it. However, students, you will be surprised to know that all these animals, they are placed in the same family, which is the family of Felidae. Similarly, dogs, jackals and wolves, they are placed under the family Canidae. The next taxonomic category is order. So we saw earlier that categories such as species, genus and families were based on several similar characters or characteristics. But as we move to the higher taxonomic categories, we see that they are identified on the aggregates of characters. And what does that mean? Right, so this simply means that the organisms belonging to the same categories exhibit even fewer similar characters. For example, order Carnivora, it includes families like Felidae and Canidae. Now plant family Convolvulacea and Solanaceae both are included in the order Polemonials. Now talking about class, this category includes related orders. For example, class Mammalia includes order Primata, which has monkeys, gorillas and gibbons in it. On the other hand, the same class Mammalia also consists of order Carnivora, which as we studied earlier includes animals like tigers, cats and dogs. Now we have phylum. A phylum is a level of classification which is placed below kingdom and above class in the hierarchy pyramid. It is a group of related classes. For example, classes like fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, they are placed under a common phylum called phylum Chordata. Now, do you know the reason behind it? Well, this is because they all possess some common features like the presence of a notochord, pharyngeal slits, a postanal tail, and a dorsal hollow nerve cord. Now let's talk about the kingdom. So it is the largest division of living beings and hence the highest taxonomic category. All animals belonging to various phyla are assigned to the highest category called kingdom Animalia. Similarly, kingdom Plantae comprises of all the plants from various divisions. So after understanding these classifications of living organisms deeply, we can clearly say that the lower the taxa, the more are the characteristics that the members within the taxon share. For example, dogs as a species share more characteristics with each other than they share with cats under a common class, which was mammalia. Alright, let us now take a closer look at the classification of human beings and the categories to which they belong. So as discussed earlier, our biological name is Homo sapiens. The family to which we human beings belong is, it's Hominidae. The order which we share is Primata, The class which we belong to is Mammalia, and the phylum is Chordata. Now the highest taxonomic category which we all share is Kingdom Animalia. So students, this completes our taxonomic classification. Try to understand about the classification of various common organisms that you see in your daily life. Hello students, in our previous modules and classes we have studied how different organisms in this living world share similarities as well as dissimilarities. Yes, and that's where classification steps in. Classification is a long step process which divides the organisms into different rank or category based on some alike features. It simplifies our living world like a magic. Isn't that fun? Alright, so we had also adventured the world of the taxonomic hierarchy. The head of this is the kingdom, followed by phylum, and phylum is also known as, it is also known as division. This is followed by class, order, family, genus, and last but not the least, species. The lower the taxa, more common are the shared characteristics. Now, as there are billions of microorganisms, plants, and animals in our living world, classification just simplifies everything for us. It makes the study of these easier by dividing them into taxonomic categories. But have you ever wondered how is this identification, naming, and classification done? So students, ironically, this is a time-taking, extensive, but a worth it process. Now, biologists over the time have devised ways to make this happen. They have come out with the tools that would indeed supplement the study of our living world in a rather fun and simple way. And those ways are nothing but the taxonomical aids. Now, what's a taxonomical aid? So in simple words, taxonomical aids are the collection of samples of preserved organisms that help in the research of taxonomic hierarchy. Now, taxonomic studies, they are useful in various walks of life, such as the agriculture, the forestry, the industrial applications, etc. Now, these taxonomical aids, they lend a helping hand to identify and classify the organisms for attaining their maximum potentials. How kind, isn't it? Alright, so the basic concept behind this is to identify, name, and classify the organisms for our reference and study. For this purpose, the collection of actual specimens of plants and animal species is the first essential step. This, in a way, not only preserves the information about them, but it also preserves the specimens as well. Now let us dig deeper into the taxonomical aids. So here on the screen you can see some of the taxonomical aids, but they are not limited to just these which are shown here on the screen. So we have the herbarium, botanical gardens, biological museums, zoological parks, keys, flora, manuals, monographs, and catalogs. So let's discuss the herbarium first. So a herbarium is a collection of dried plant specimens mounted on sheets of paper. They are a wealth of information collected about the plants, their date and place of collection, their English, local and botanical names, their family, collector's name, etc. These herbarium sheets are storehouse to study how one species differs from another, or whether a specimen represents a new species altogether. They also facilitate the study of chemical and morphological variations of plant species, giving us an idea about the species that are threatened and so on. Now the next 8 is Botanical Gardens. As the name holds, Botanical Gardens or Botanic Gardens are dedicated to the collection, cultivation, preservation, and display of a wide range of plants with their botanical or scientific names and their families. Wonder why? Well, because they supplement scientific research, conservation, display, and education, to name a few. Now, it is a smart way to shout out Save the Earth by conservation of plants in an eco-friendly and sustainable way. So do you know the largest botanical garden of India? Yes, so the largest botanical garden in India is Indian Botanic Garden in Kolkata. Alright, so we have studied about plants. Want to study about animals now? So let's just head to zoological parks, or as we say it, the zoos. So here, wild animals are kept in a protected environment. They are studied, bred, and exhibited to the public. Did you know the abbreviation zoo first appeared in print in the United Kingdom around 1847? Alright, now let's talk about the biological museums. This is yet another interesting way to achieve the goal of storing and preserving the information as well as the specimens. So plants and animals are sometimes preserved as dry specimens. Insects are preserved in insect boxes after collecting, killing, and pinning. Large animals, for example the birds and mammals, they are stuffed and preserved in containers. The preservative solution, which is formalin, is used for meeting this goal of preservation. Now, organisms as tiny as insects to as big as mammals are also preserved in a biological museum. Now, next comes the key. No, I'm not talking about the lock and the key, the taxonomic keys. So, taxonomic keys, which are also called as identification keys, are yet another taxonomical aid which are used for the identification of plants and animals based on the similarities and dissimilarities. Key enables the user to identify a completely new organism. And how does it work exactly? Well, each key is a series of questions about the contrasting characteristics, generally in a pair called couplet. Various statements are made and comparisons are done by selecting or eliminating the characters present in such a way as to separate the organisms. This is continued until all the organisms have been identified. And each statement in a key is called a lead. Now, keys are generally analytical. Alright, so let's quickly talk about flora now, which is another taxonomical tool to help in recording descriptions about the plants found in a particular area. They contain full account and distribution of plants in a given area. Did you know they also provide details about the rare and endemic species of that given geographical area? Alright, now let's talk about what are manuals. Simply put, a manual is a book giving instructions or information. A manual is a taxonomic aid which acts as a guiding tool to accurately identify and classify different plants and animals. These are basically guidelines to categorize the organisms. Now we also have monograph that contains information of any one taxon, while a catalog is a list of names, titles, and articles which are arranged systematically. So we have seen how the living world is rich and diverse. There are millions of living organisms. How brilliantly taxonomy, or the science of naming, defining, and classifying groups of biological organisms based on shared characteristics does half the work, making it easier to study or even just have fun with wonders lying around there. Our biologists are no less. They have designed new tools and brought methods to facilitate this process smoothly in the name of taxonomical aids that we've just covered. So what are you waiting for? The next time you see an organism, try to recall how many steps it took to be credited in your eyes. Simply enjoy. We will now begin with a very important and an interesting unit, that is diversity in the living world. So under this unit, we will study about the various types of organisms present in this living world, hence making it a diverse collection of living organisms. If you look around, you will see a large variety of living organisms, be it potted plants, insects, birds, your pets, and other animals and plants. So, in your general observation, you must have noticed all these large variety of living organisms. Each different kind of plant, animal, or organism that you see represents a species. So, each kind of organism that you see around yourself, it represents one or the other species. Here you can see a mammal or an animal, the dog, which is a part of the diversity of this living world. The number of species that are known and described range between 1.7 to 1.8 million. So the total number of species that have been known till now is 1.7 to 1.8 million. This refers to biodiversity, or the number and types of organisms present on Earth. So basically this is what constitutes biodiversity, that is the diversity of the living organisms present on the Earth. Here you can see the living organisms present underwater inside deep oceans. So that was the general introduction about the diversity in the living world. We now come over to two important definitions which are related to the diversity of organisms, that is nomenclature and identification. So we'll study what are these two. First, nomenclature. Naming of living organisms such that a particular organism is known by the same name all over the world is called nomenclature. So what is nomenclature? It is the naming of the living organisms so that the same name is there for the organism all over the world. And what is identification? Nomenclature or naming is only possible when the organism is described correctly and we know to what organism the name is attached to. So this is called identification. So as the name suggests, it is basically identifying the organism before naming it or giving it a nomenclature. So the correct description of the organism and knowing what name is attached to which organism is known as identification. Now the scientific names. They are provided by the International Code for Botanical Nomenclature, that is ICBN, to the plants, and the International Code for Zoological Nomenclature, that is ICZN, to animals. And they follow the concept of binomial nomenclature. So there's something called scientific name of an organism, and it is provided by ICBN to plants, that is the Code for Botanical Nomenclature, botanical referring to plants, and ICZN, that is the International Code for Zoological Nomenclature, zoological referring to animals. And the scientific names, they strictly follow the concept of binomial nomenclature, about which we'll study now. What is binomial nomenclature? Biologists follow universally accepted principles to provide scientific names to known organisms. Each name has two components, the generic name and the specific epithet. So basically, universally accepted principles, they are used by biologists to provide scientific names to organisms. And the scientific name, it is made up of two parts, the generic name and the specific epithet. This system of providing a name with two components is called as binomial nomenclature. So these were the features of the binomial nomenclature, which is used by ICBN and ICZN respectively for plants and animals to provide scientific names. We'll now study what are the rules of the binomial nomenclature. The very first rule is biological names are generally in Latin and written in italics. So the names are in Latin and they are written in italics. They are Latinized or derived from Latin irrespective of their origin. So irrespective of where the origin of the organism is, the names are Latinized or derived from Latin. The second rule, the first word in a biological name represents the genus, while
while the second component, it denotes the specific epithet. So we had studied that there are two components of a biological name in binomial nomenclature, that is the generic name and the specific epithet. So the first word, it represents the generic name or the genus, and the second component, it denotes the specific epithet. The third rule, both the words in a biological name when handwritten are separately underlined or printed in italics to indicate their Latin origin. So whenever we write a biological name, that is whenever it is handwritten, both the words, they are separately underlined. This is very important. They are separately underlined or they are printed in italics so as to indicate their Latin origin. So these are the rules of biological nomenclature which are strictly followed by the ICBN and ICZN to provide names or scientific names to plants and animals respectively. So those were the three basic rules of binomial nomenclature. We now see what is meant by the term classification. Classification is the process by which anything is grouped into convenient categories based on some easily observable characters. So under classification, organisms are grouped into convenient categories based on some observable characters. Example, we easily recognize groups such as plants or animals or dogs, cats or insects. So basically we have classified organisms into plants and animals on the basis of some observable characters. So this is something called classification. The moment we use any of these terms, we associate certain characters with the organism in that group. So using these terms like plants, animals, dogs, cats, insects, we are associating some characters with the organism in that group. So that was classification. Now another terminology related to the diversity in the living world and a very important term is taxonomy. When living organisms can be classified based on characteristics into different taxa, that is categories, this process of classification is called taxonomy. So whenever living organisms, they are classified based on categories or taxa, then this process of classification is called taxonomy. Now here in this image you can see a beautiful representation of a part of the diversity of this living world, including flowers, trees, plants and animals. So it's shown beautifully. So these were some of the terminologies we have studied related to the diversity in this living world.